the biggest problems in the country, the most predictable crisis in American history. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
Is the time for the Republicans' time having expired?
Republicans have 3 minutes remaining.
Our time, if there is any.
Thank you.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I haven't been able to watch all the speeches by my friends on the other side of the aisle, but I've watched enough to understand what's going on. Do we have order?
Senate come to order. Will senators please take their conversations off the floor?
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, this has been a remarkable show of hubris or arrogance from the Republican side of the aisle. One after another, the Republicans have stood to complain about how the Senate hasn't gotten a lot done. Mr. President, the presiding officer has been one of the leaders in having a more effective Senate because my friend, the presiding officer, has watched what the Republicans have done. We're going to do something about it. The presiding officer knows that. I know that. What they have done is the very definition of chutzpah. Nerve. What nerve, Mr. President? They're complaining about a result that they themselves created. They've created the fact we haven't gotten anything done. They're good at it. From stopping a bill, Mr. President, stopping a bill that would allow veterans to get jobs. They stopped it on a technicality. They have conducted filibuster after filibuster, blocking one bill after another. And then they complain the Senate can't pass anything when they're the ones holding things up. The record is pretty detailed and deep, and I'm not going to cover it all today because really it is significant. I said here yesterday, I've been the leader for 6 years. I may be off 1 or 2. I've had to file motions to overcome 382 filibusters in 6 years. Now, I know the Senate's changed a little bit since Lyndon Johnson was the majority leader. But during the 6 years that he was the majority leader, he had to file cloture once. To think that they're here complaining that we're not getting anything done when they're the ones that caused it. And, Mr. President, we start from this point. I have to say, the Republican leader, I appreciate his being so candid and honest with the American people. When he stood at the beginning of this Congress, that his #1 goal was to stop President Obama from being reelected. That is what he said. And they have legislated accordingly, stopping us from doing the most important thing for this country. Measures to create jobs, they have stopped. Measures to stop jobs from being lost, they've stopped. They've done it so many times. Mr. President, how about this? We've lost approximately 1 million teachers, firefighters, and police officers because of Republican stopping us from getting things done, really hurting state and local government. So we over here thought it would be a good idea that we stop these significant layoffs of teachers, firefighters, and police officers. And we wanted to make sure that it's paid for, and we agreed that it should be paid for. So we said, okay, no more layoffs of teachers, firefighters, and police officers, and we're going to pay for it. How are we going to pay for it? anyone making more than $1 million a year would have to pay a surtax of 0.3%. Every Republican voted against that. The Veterans Jobs Bill that I just talked about. Cybersecurity bill. Mr. President, the Pentagon has said the most important issue facing this country is cybersecurity. The National Security Agency, most important issue facing this country, cybersecurity. We know, they know, the Republicans know, because they were down at the same demonstration I had of our intelligence agency showing what would happen if a cybersecurity attack took place in the Northeast, just dealing with the power grid. We know it can happen. Senator Feinstein, I've heard her say several times, the chairman of our Intelligence Committee, it's not a question if, it's a question of when. The Republicans blocked a cybersecurity bill, stopped it. They've conducted filibuster after filibuster, blocking one bill after another. They blocked a bill to stop outsourcing jobs more than once. On all these TV ads that you've seen, we thought it would be kind of a good idea that the American people knew who was paying for these ads. But no, twice they said, no, let's keep them secret. Crossroads USA, or whatever the name they have there, committee on all these names that sound so good, but we would be better served, I think, if people knew the ads were being paid for by the Koch brothers, or Sheldon Adelson from Las Vegas, or Simmons from Texas, who's boasting about giving $34 million to defeat President Obama, and that's what the Republican leader wants. Passage of several small businesses jobs bill, one July 12th, just a month or two ago. Motion to proceed, paycheck fairness, violence against women. They've stopped going conference on that. April 16th, they blocked a motion to proceed to a bill to reduce the deficit by imposing a minimum tax rate on high-income taxpayers, the Buffett rule. Warren Buffett, he wants to make sure that he pays a tax rate comparable to his secretary. That's what we wanted. They defeated that. They've blocked many bills dealing with unnecessary tax subsidies for these large oil companies. They've held up hundreds of measures out of the Energy Committee. Hundreds. It used to be we'd pass here just matter-of-factly. Senator Stabenow had a terrific amendment to prevent a tax increase on American businesses. And she wanted to do it by extending the expiring tax credits for energy. That's created hundreds of thousands of jobs in America. They blocked the nomination for weeks and weeks of Cordray to be the director of Bureau of Consumer Financial Formation. They blocked judge after judge after judge. They blocked the motion to proceed to a bill that put workers back on the job while rebuilding and modernizing America. Infrastructure creates jobs. They blocked motions to proceed to a bill to keep teachers, first responders, in addition to the one I just talked about, other ones. They blocked reauthorized the Economic Development Administration. This has been something we have done for 25, 30 years. They blocked it. We wanted to reduce the deficit by doing something about these outlandish subsidies we give big oil. Blocked it. We were trying to do a bill, create some jobs. We spent weeks because they wanted to dictate what women could do dealing with contraception. And then they've got this deal they have with the House Republicans. If we work and are able once in a while to get something done over here, like a postal bill, to save our postal system, then the then the Republicans block it in the House. Farm bill, reduce the debt by $23 billion. They have this deal with the House, now they block that. China currency, same thing. They block it over there in the House. The record is very, very clear, Mr. President. The party of trying to defeat President Obama has done everything they can to make the economy look as bad as they can, because they think if the economy is really bad, it's going to help them get reelected, defeat President Obama. The middle class, we know how they feel about the middle class. That was exemplified by statements come out in the last few days by their presidential nominee. Mr. President, this morning as I said, I wasn't able to listen to everything, but I listened to enough. One party stands for obstruction and the rich. Mr. President, the big lie. Listen to this. How many times did we have the Republicans come to this floor and say they have not passed a budget? Mr. President, I have served in this Congress for 30 years, and I've admired two people very, very much for their knowledge of certain things. But one person I have admired dealing with the finances of this country more than anyone else is someone that I came to the Senate with 26 years ago, Kent Conrad. Kent Conrad has come here and time again and said, yes, we didn't pass a budget resolution because we didn't need to. We passed a law. That's why the CR is going forward. We passed a law that set numbers for us. It is a big lie for them to come here and say we haven't passed a budget. It is a lie. It's untruthful. Now, Mr. President, my friend who we've served in Congress, we came the same day, senior senator from Arizona. I've said before, I say again, I admire him. I admire his service to our country. But for him to come and say that the Senate is not working well because of the Democrats, that's one of the big lies. We have tried to legislate. They are holding up virtually everything we try to do, including the defense authorization bill. I've been waiting for months for them to come to me with an agreement. This is part of their big game they're playing here to try to make us look bad when they're the cause of it, Mr. President. They're the reason we haven't done this legislation. We can't. We spend weeks on things that we would have done in a matter of an hour, 20 minutes before. Republicans are complaining about a result that they themselves caused. The defense authorization bill, we're going to come back here after the election and we'll get that done with their help. Mr. President, here's the issue with the Republicans. Here's why suddenly they're all upset. They've been upset for some time, but really this week has been something that would upset nearly anyone, because we thought the Olympics were over, but yesterday we saw it in full go. We had Republicans running to break marathon records, sprint records to get away from their presidential nominee. Because it makes it a little hard for them when they have someone that's running for president representing their party who says, I'm only going to worry about half the people in this country. We're going to continue to work to the best that we can, Mr. President, to move forward with the legislation that we feel is important. We're going to come back after the lame duck, during the lame duck after the election, and hopefully they will decide at that time maybe they have something better to do than to try to make the President of the United States look bad. Now, Mr. President, we have been, we're a very fortunate country. We have a two-party system that's envy of the rest of the world. These parliamentary governments, they work for months and weeks and sometimes longer than that to try to form a government. We don't have to do that. We're a government of laws, and we have a system that works pretty well. But we know, based on some academic work that's been done, it's just not me up here talking. We have two of the foremost experts that have watched this country for more than 40 years. Thomas Mann from the Brookings Institute, Norm Ornstein from the Conservative American Enterprise Institute said the problem with government today is the Republicans. They said they had been here all for 40 years. They've never seen anything like it. I haven't seen anything like it. I've been here 30 years. We used to work together, Mr. President. When I came here to the Senate, we had Republican senators and Democratic senators. We joined hands and we got things done. But now, because they are being led by someone who believes that the most important thing to do is to defeat Obama, we're getting nothing done, and they're following him like lemmings off the cliff.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, one of the greatest orators in the history of the English-speaking people was Winston Churchill. I can't tell you how many times I've read and reread his speeches and heard his great efforts to summon the courage of the British people during World War II. In one respect, the speech earlier this morning by Senator McConnell was Churchillian, in the tradition of Winston Churchill. Because they once said to Winston Churchill, "What do you think history will have to say about you?" He said, "I'm not worried about what history has to say about me because I'm going to write the history." This morning, Senator McConnell decided to write the history of the Senate session. And unfortunately, his version was a little bit different than the memory of most of us in terms of what's actually happened. Oh, this we do remember. In the beginning of the Obama presidency, a short time after the president had been sworn in and asked to try to take this failing economy and put it back on its feet, when we were losing 750,000 jobs a month, when businesses were failing, when American families were losing 1/3 of the value of their savings, when the stock market was plummeting, when we run the risk of a global fiscal crisis, when we were sending $800 billion to the biggest banks in America to save them from their own greed and stupidity, at that time, the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, said, "My highest priority is to make sure that Barack Obama is a one-term president." His highest priority. Well, that's fact. That's on the record. That's on tape if you want to see it. And he lived up to that in terms of his own ambition as the Republican leader. When the president came up with a stimulus bill to turn this economy around, we had 3 Republicans who would join us. 3 of them. What happened to those 3 Republicans? One of them, Senator Specter of Pennsylvania, was then threatened with defeat in the Republican primary for joining in a bipartisan effort to save the economy. He switched parties, came over to the Democratic side. He said, "It isn't the Republican Party I remember." Another one, Senator Snowe of Maine, announced her retirement a few months back and said, "I can't take the partisanship and division." The third, Senator Collins, still survives. Those 3 were the only 3 who would stand up with the president to try to get this economy back on track. When it came to health care reform, after months of effort by Senator Baucus to bring in Republicans to craft the bill, Senator Grassley, who was leading the effort on the Republican side, went back to Iowa in August, had a town meeting and said, "I'm finished. No more bipartisan negotiation on health care reform." And they wouldn't give us a single vote, not one vote, to pass health care reform. Same thing true when it came to Wall Street reform, to put in oversight to avoid another fiscal crisis generated by the perfidy of greed on Wall Street. Time and time and time again, the Republicans refused to stand with us. To my left here, Senator Conrad, North Dakota, has been our chairman of the Budget Committee. He put in a sincere, bipartisan, good faith effort to deal with the deficit with Senator Judd Gregg, a Republican of New Hampshire, a man who commanded respect on his side of the aisle, as Senator Conrad does as well. And they came up with a notion, and here's what it was. We would create a commission that would investigate the deficit crisis. And if 14 of the 18 members of the commission voted to go forward, it would come immediately to the floor for a vote. You know, we had a lot of senators who were co-sponsoring it. Democrats and Republicans finally said that will break the logjam. And then we called it on the floor, Senator Conrad. Does my memory serve me correctly that the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, who was a co-sponsor of this commission, deficit commission, along with 6 other Republican senators, changed their votes on the floor and defeated the very bill they had co-sponsored to deal with our nation's deficit? You didn't hear that this morning, did you? All the speeches from the other side about dealing with the deficit. Perhaps Senator McConnell and those 6 other senators, those still remaining, would like to explain why they reversed course and said no, they didn't want to be part of the effort. But it happened. It happened for certain. And as Senator Reid came to the floor and explained, they have broken all records in the United States Senate for filibusters. Boy, I tell you what, if you've got a cable TV at home and you have C-SPAN on it and you turn on the Senate, I know a lot of people across America are calling into the cable channel providers and asking for a refund. Why in the world do we have this channel where nothing happens except an occasional mention of a senator's name during a quorum call? You know why? 382 filibusters on the Republican side. 382 delays in the Senate. Well, what kind of things are they filibustering? Just saw one this week. A veterans' jobs bill. A veterans' jobs bill was subject of a 2-week filibuster. A bill which should have passed by voice vote if every senator who went back home for a 4th of July parade, grabbed the flag and walked down the middle of the street and said how much they loved the veterans, would have voted for it, we would have passed it. Instead, a filibuster. One of 382 filibusters. I'm glad Senator Conrad's here to explain this whole budget resolution issue. He can do it better than anyone. But I will tell you this, Senator. I took a look this morning of the 30 senators on the Republican side who got up to speak. About 10 of them talked about the fact that there was no budget, that we didn't have a budget this year, we don't have a budget next year. And then I took a look at the votes on the Budget Control Act. Those same 10 senators voted for the Budget Control Act, a law which controls the budget for 2 years. I am calling for an official investigation by the attending physician to see if there is something in the coffee urn in the Republican cloakroom causing amnesia, that these senators would come to the floor and forget that they voted for the Budget Control Act and make speeches like they didn't, or they never heard of it. Let me also say something about entitlements. Senator McConnell spoke to the issue of entitlements. He's right. It's an important part of what we need to do to right this ship, to deal with our deficit. It would have been part of the conversation for the commission, the Conrad Gregg Commission, which 7 Republican senators torpedoed, including the Republican majority leader. You can go through the bills, as the majority leader has, and talk about efforts that we've made. We have passed some bills on a bipartisan basis. We passed a postal reform bill to make sure that the best postal service in the world survives, passed it with a bipartisan vote, dead in the House. We passed a transportation bill. Senator Boxer, Senator Inhofe put it together. Strong bipartisan vote to build the infrastructure of America, passed it in the Senate, died in the House. We passed a farm bill. Senator Stabenow of Michigan, Senator Roberts of Kansas, bipartisan farm bill that gave us a good architecture for the future of farm programs and reduced the deficit by $23 billion, passed it on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, died in the House of Representatives. The Tea Party faction in the House will not allow it to go forward. Senator Reid also made the point. What was the first amendment, the first Republican amendment on the transportation bill? Think about this for a second. First Republican amendment of the transportation bill, they wouldn't let us move forward to that bill unless we would consider an amendment which would reduce the opportunity for women across America to have access to family planning. On the transportation bill, and they are arguing that we're finding ways to slow down the Senate. Well, the Blunt Amendment was defeated, but it's an indication of the political gamesmanship that's gone on at the expense of important bills like the transportation bill. And the last point I want to make is this. We know that if we're going to thrive in this country, the middle-class working families in this country need a chance. Senator on this side of the aisle, as well as President Obama, want to give working families, middle-income families, a tax break. And we passed it so that they'll have a tax reduction to help them as they struggle from paycheck to paycheck. Sent it over to the House of Representatives, where it is never going to be taken up for a vote. That is the sad reality. So as the Republicans came to the floor this morning and gave us this grand vision of when they were in control, they tried to rewrite history. Maybe Churchill was capable of doing that, but I would say the Republican senators failed to meet that challenge this morning. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from North Dakota is recognized.
First, I thank my colleagues for their kind words, Senator Reid, our leader, and Senator Durbin, my colleague. I very much appreciate those kind words. I also must say I'm a little taken aback by what I heard earlier on the floor from some of our Republican colleagues, because it really does represent an attempt to rewrite history, at least the history that I've lived. I'm in my 26th year in the United States Senate. I announced a year and a half ago, a little more than that, that I would not seek re-election. So I don't have a political ox to gore here, but I am here to report what I have seen after 26 years of service here. And let me just start by saying our Republican colleagues at the leadership level decided early on that their strategy to be successful was to stop things from passing in the United States Senate. It is very clear that has been their strategy. That's why we have seen more than 380 filibusters in this body, which is completely unprecedented in the history of the United States Senate. Because the Republican leader made very clear years ago his highest priority was to defeat for re-election President Obama. He did not say his top priority was to solve the problems of the country. He did not say his top priority was to get our economy back on track. He did not say his top priority was to address the deficits and debt of the nation. He did not say his top priority was to improve the security position of the United States. He said his top priority was to defeat President Obama. Shame on him. Shame on him. That should never be the top priority of a leader in this body, Republican or Democrat. The top priority ought to be to help solve the problems the country confronts. Mr. President, I'm a little cranky because many of my colleagues know my wife and I have a little dog, Dakota, who's suffering from cancer. And last night we were up from 12:30 to 5:30 as he was bleeding internally. And so I must say I'm a little cranky, having been up most of the night. And I got a lot crankier when I heard colleagues say things that they know are not true. That they know are not true. When they say there is no budget for the United States, they know that is not true. How do I know that it is true, that there is a budget? Well, because I remember what we voted on, and it's in writing. It's a law. It's called the Budget Control Act. And the Budget Control Act passed last year contained the budget for 2012 and 2013. Some say, well, that's not a budget. Well, let's look to the language of the law itself and see what it says. Here's what it says. For the purpose of enforcing the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, including Section 300 of that act, and enforcing budgetary points of order in prior concurrent resolutions on the budget, the allocations, aggregates, and spending levels set shall apply in the Senate in the same manner as for a concurrent resolution on the budget. What they're trying to do is mislead the American people by saying we've not passed a budget resolution. What they fail to tell people is that instead of a budget resolution, we passed a budget law. What's the difference? A resolution is purely a congressional document. It never goes to the president for his signature. A budget resolution is purely a congressional document. It never goes to the president for his signature. So instead of a resolution, we passed a budget law called the Budget Control Act. And it set out spending limits not just for 2012 and 2013. It actually set out on the discretionary side of the budget limits for 10 years. Mr. President, in fact, the Budget Control Act, in many ways, is more extensive than any budget resolution could provide. It has the force of law, unlike a budget resolution that's not signed by the president. It set discretionary caps on spending for 10 years instead of the 1 year normally set in a budget resolution. It provided enforcement mechanisms, including a 2-year provision allowing budget points of order to be enforced, and it created a reconciliation-like super committee process to address entitlement and tax reforms, and said if the special committee couldn't agree on reforming the entitlement programs and the tax system of the United States, there would be an additional $1.2 trillion in spending cuts. Mr. President, let's add it up. The Budget Control Act first cut $900 billion from the discretionary accounts over 10 years. Then it said if the super committee didn't reform the tax system, didn't reform the entitlement system of the country, there'd be another $1.2 trillion from the discretionary accounts over the next 10 years. That is a total of $2.1 trillion in spending cuts over the next 10 years. That is the biggest package of spending cuts in the history of the United States. Now, that's a fact. The Budget Control Act set the spending limits for 2012 and 2013 and further set limits for 8 years beyond that. So when they say there's no budget resolution, what they fail to tell people is there is a budget law. Now, Mr. President, it's interesting if we compare and contrast what their side presented as their priorities in a budget, because Mr. Ryan, now their candidate for vice president, came before the House of Representatives and laid out his budget blueprint. And what does that do? Well, first of all, it extends all of the Bush-era tax cuts. Now, think about this. Here we have a circumstance in which the revenue of the country is at or near a 60-year low. And the first thing the Ryan budget does is extend all the Bush-era tax cuts, even those for the very highest income, but then says, but that's not enough for the wealthiest among us. So the Ryan budget, after extending all the Bush-era tax cuts, goes and provides another $1 trillion of tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. I got nothing against wealthy people. I would hope all Americans have the opportunity to become wealthy. That'd be my fondest hope. That's really why I was drawn to public service. What could I do that would strengthen the economy of the United States? It's always been my top priority. It's what I truly believe is essential to our democracy. But in a circumstance in which we're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar we spend, to say the answer is more and more tax cuts for the very wealthiest among us, and then to try to pay for it by shredding the social safety net that is critically important to those who are the least fortunate among us, Frankly, I think that fails the moral test. I think that fails any moral test of government. The Ryan budget, which our colleagues have endorsed here, would give, on average, those earning over $1 million a year an additional tax reduction of $265,000 a year. Now, I know if I were listening to this, I'd say, how can it be that somebody earning over $1 million can get a $265,000 tax cut? Because that's about all they'd pay in taxes. Remember, we're talking about the average for those earning over $1 million a year. So we're talking about not just people who earn $1 million a year, but people who earn hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And the average tax cut provided in the Ryan budget for those folks is another $265,000 a year. Now, Mr. President, what does Ryan do in order to offset that massive additional tax cut for the very wealthiest among us? Well, here is an interesting quote from a former top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan, a man named Bruce Bartlett, who was a top economic advisor to Ronald Reagan. Here's what he said about the Ryan budget that our colleagues here have endorsed. Distributionally, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts, while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. Even as an opening bid to begin budget negotiations with the Democrats, the Ryan plan cannot be taken seriously. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage. It's just pandering to the Tea Party. A real act of courage would have been for him to admit, as all serious budget analysts know, that the revenues will have to rise well above 19% of GDP to stabilize the debt. Mr. President, those are not my words. Those are the words of a top economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan. The Ryan plan is a monstrosity. Mr. President, if anybody seriously studies the Ryan budget, you'd have to conclude that Mr. Bartlett is correct, because not only does he cut taxes in a very dramatic way for the richest among us. Let me just be clear. First thing he does is extend all the Bush-era tax cuts. Then on top of that, he cuts the top rate from 35% to 25%. That provides over $1 trillion of additional tax cuts for the wealthiest among us. And they refuse to do anything to close the tax loopholes that are allowing certain wealthy people to avoid paying taxes in this country entirely. I've shown on the floor of the Senate many times a picture of a 5-story building in the Cayman Islands called the Udlin House. The Udlin House claims to be the home of 18,000 companies. A little 5-story building in the Cayman Islands claims to be the home of 18,000 companies. I've said that's the most efficient building in the world. Can you imagine 18,000 companies operating out of a little 5-story building down in the Cayman Islands? All those companies claim they're doing business out of that little building for a reason. They claim they're doing business out of that little building in the Cayman Islands because they don't want to pay taxes in the United States. And so you know what they do? It's very clever. Through paper manipulations, they show the profits of certain of their companies in the Cayman Islands rather than in the places where they actually earned the profits. Well, why would they do that? Well, because the Cayman Islands doesn't have a corporate income tax. And so by showing their profits in the Cayman Islands, even though in truth they were never earned in the Cayman Islands, but through accounting gimmicks, they show their profits in the Cayman Islands, they aren't taxed. And they avoid paying here what they legitimately owe here. And what does that mean? That means all the rest of us get stuck paying for ourselves and them. Mr. President, the Ryan budget, I said earlier, fails the moral test. Well, you know, it's not just my judgment that it fails the moral test, because how can you justify cutting taxes dramatically for the wealthiest among us and then turn around and shred Medicare, which is what the Ryan budget did. The Ryan budget that he initially proposed took Medicare, which currently finances 75% of health care costs for seniors who are eligible. The Ryan budget over time would switch that so that instead of Medicare paying 75%, Medicare would pay 32%. So just to be clear, under the Ryan plan, we would wind up with a situation in which the majority of your health care costs, if you're eligible for Medicare, would be paid by you, not by Medicare. That's to make up for the massive tax cuts he gives the wealthiest among us. Here's what the Catholic bishops said. The Catholic bishops said the Ryan budget fails the moral test. Mr. President, I agree with the Catholic bishops. This is what they said in the leads. This is in the Washington Post in 2012. A week after House Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan said that his Catholic faith inspired the Republicans' cost-cutting budget plan, the nation's Catholic bishops reiterated their demand that the federal budget protect the poor and said the GOP measure fails to meet these moral criteria. Mr. President, in any moral test that I know of in any religion, you don't take from those who have the least to give it to those who have the most. I don't know of any religion that practices that as an article of faith, that you take from those that have the least to give to those that have the most. Now, anybody that knows me knows I'm pretty conservative. I come from a business family. I have a master's in business administration. I have been, throughout my career, somebody who has been judged fiscally conservative, somebody that believes deeply in balancing budgets. I was the grandfather of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, served on it proudly, was one of the 11 votes for its product, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent. And by the way, when our colleague said this morning we haven't worked in a bipartisan way, well, I've spent 5 years working in a bipartisan way to try to get our deficits and debt under control. Senator Gregg, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, and I proposed the Bowles-Simpson Commission. We served on it. We voted for it. Subsequently served in the group of 6, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, that were given the assignment by our colleagues to come up with a plan to reduce the deficit. Worked a year and a half to try to find a bipartisan solution. We've had the Biden group. We've had the super committee, all bipartisan efforts that have gone on for years to try to produce an agreement. So our friends saying there hasn't been an effort, that's just not true. But what is also true is when our friends on the other side were in charge, they brought this economy to the brink of financial collapse. Now, that's the truth. Anybody who doubts it, simply go back to the end of the Bush administration and see where the country was. The stock market was collapsing. The housing market was collapsing. The financial system was collapsing. That's what President Obama inherited. He did not create those crises. He inherited them. At the time President Obama came into office, the economy was shrinking at a rate of almost 9% a year. We were losing 800,000 jobs a month. Now the economy is growing at a rate of about 2% a year, and we're gaining about 200,000 jobs a month. That is a dramatic turnaround. So when they ask the question, are we better off now than 4 years ago? Undeniably, we are better off. Undeniably, we are better off. We've gone from an economy shrinking at a rate of more than 8% to one growing 2%. We have moved from a time when we were losing 800,000 jobs a month to a time when we are gaining 200,000 jobs a month. We have gone from a circumstance in which the stock market was plunging to a circumstance in which the stock market has about doubled during the time of President Barack Obama. President Obama inherited 2 wars, a war on terror, a financial system that was collapsing, a financial system that had seen under the previous president the debt double, foreign holdings of U.S. debt were tripled, and this president has ended the slide and got us going back in the right direction, and with precious little help from the other side. Mr. President, I ask the American people before they cast their votes to think back to the final days of the Bush administration. I will never forget, as long as I live, being called to an emergency meeting in this building with the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, the leaders, Republicans and Democrats of the House and the Senate, and being told by the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve that if they did not act, they expected a financial collapse within days. A financial collapse within days. Those were in the final months of the Bush administration. That is what President Barack Obama inherited. The hard fact is, when our colleagues were in charge of everything, they had the House, they had the Senate, they controlled the White House, they brought this country to the brink of financial collapse. That is a fact. Mr. President, thank goodness this president, acting with this Congress, was able to draw us back from the brink. But we got a long way to go. We got a long way to go. And it's going to take everybody working together to pull this out of the ditch completely. I have been part of major efforts for the last 5 years, bipartisan efforts. Bowles-Simpson, Group of 6. Right now, we have the Group of 6 has been expanded to a Group of 8. We have been working nonstop. Hundreds of hours of discussions on a bipartisan plan, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, to be enacted when we return, to get America back on track. And Mr. President, that's what's required here. What we saw this morning from our colleagues on the other side, that's not the answer. That's the problem. The same old, tired political gamesmanship is not going to cut it. What we desperately need is Republicans and Democrats working together to solve America's problems. That's what we owe the American people. And I very much hope when we return after this election that colleagues on both sides will be prepared to act in that spirit. I thank the chair and yield the floor.
The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. President, I am very proud to follow Chairman Conrad to the floor at this time. There is no person in the United States Senate who has worked harder on a budget compromise than Senator Conrad has. There is no person who has put out the hand of bipartisan friendship and cooperation more than Senator Conrad has. There is no person who has experienced more frustration of having that hand rejected and slapped away than Senator Conrad has, and there is no person who has contained that frustration and continued to work forward and seek a resolution in a dignified way than Senator Conrad has. The Senate Republicans who took to the floor this morning to criticize Democrats for failing to pass a budget and deal with the impending sequester and tax cuts expiration failed to note that Senate Democrats have in fact passed a budget law and a bill to extend the tax cuts for 98% of Americans and 97% of small businesses. It's to protect the 2% and the 3% at the top of the income level that Republicans have refused to allow that bill protecting 98% of Americans and 97% of small businesses from tax increases from going forward. Senate Democrats also support a balanced approach to replacing the sequester and reducing the deficit. What they didn't talk much about, but which is very important in this discussion, is the Ryan Plan, the Republican Ryan Plan for the budget. This past May, 41 of our Senate Republican colleagues voted in favor of a radical transformation of the America we know. And the Republican-controlled House passed this budget, a budget that would devastate the middle class. The plan would end Medicare as we know it for future retirees. It would reopen the Medicare prescription drug donut hole that we closed for current retirees. It would slash investments that America's children depend on, from Head Start to federal college age. And it would give the average $1 million and over earner a new additional tax cut of, on average, $265,000 each in that $1 million plus earner cohort. The blockade here that is preventing moving beyond the sequester is by Republicans, particularly in the House, refusing to proceed in any reasonable way and instead demanding these damaging, radical cuts for the middle class. Let's look a little bit behind the curtain of campaign rhetoric and examine the harm, the personal, real-life, real-person harm that the Ryan budget would inflict on millions of middle-class families and retirees. In what is one of the extraordinary examples of say one thing but do another rhetoric, Mr. Ryan, in his recent nomination acceptance speech, said that the greatest of all responsibilities is that of the strong to protect the weak. The truest measure of any society is how it treats those who cannot defend or care for themselves. His budget, of course, busily does exactly the opposite. It slashes taxes for the most well-off while decimating the programs on which struggling families and retirees rely. Don't take my word for it. Following the House passage of this Ryan budget, the Conference of Catholic Bishops said, and I quote, "Congress faces a difficult task to balance needs and resources and allocate burdens and sacrifices. Just solutions, however," the bishop said, "must require shared sacrifice by all, including raising adequate revenues, eliminating unnecessary military and other spending, and fairly addressing the long-term costs of health insurance and retirement programs. The House-passed budget resolution fails to meet these moral criteria." That's what the Conference of Catholic Bishops said. I'll say it again. The House-passed budget resolution failed to meet these moral criteria. That's not me speaking. That is the Conference of America's Catholic Bishops. So let's start our look behind the curtain of the budget that fails this moral test, but that Governor Romney said was marvelous, to use his word. Let's start with the budget's tax theories. The Ryan budget would lower the top tax rates for both corporations and the highest earning individuals from 35% to 25%. According to the Joint Economic Committee analysis, this would result in an average tax cut of $285,000 for Americans earning $1 million a year and more. At the same time, middle-income taxpayers making between $50,000 and $100,000 would see their taxes go up by $1,300 because middle-class deductions are stripped away to pay for the high-end cuts. Ryan would also shift at the corporate level to a so-called territorial tax system, which would mean that companies that ship jobs and operations overseas would no longer have to pay any U.S. taxes on their overseas profits. Democrats have tried repeatedly to offer tax incentives to companies that bring jobs home to the United States. And nobody in this body has worked harder on bringing jobs home to the United States than the presiding officer, the senator from Ohio, Senator Brown. Well, the Ryan plan would do exactly the opposite. It would tell big corporations that if they move their business operations overseas, they'll never pay taxes on those again. The Ryan plan is really a jobs bill for China, for India, for Korea, not for America. It's an offshoring rewards act. In addition to those upside-down tax changes that harm the middle class and raise their taxes to cut taxes for the highest earners in this country, in addition to its inducements to offshore more jobs instead of bringing them home, the Ryan budget would slash $2.9 trillion from our health care programs. Beginning for workers who retire in 2023, Mr. Ryan would convert Medicare to a voucher system, which, according to the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, would ultimately add an estimated $6,000 in annual out-of-pocket costs that our retirees, our seniors, would have to fork over. It's hard to imagine how future seniors living on a fixed Social Security income will be able to maintain health care coverage with the substantial increases in out-of-pocket costs that Mr. Ryan's budget envisions. If the Republicans are saying that they won't make the deal that spares us the sequester unless that deal puts an end to Medicare as we know it, holding Medicare hostage, well, it then takes some brass, to use President Clinton's phrase, to say that we are for the sequester. The Ryan budget doesn't stop there. It would repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away access to affordable health insurance for millions of Americans of all ages. And of course, repealing the Affordable Care Act hits seniors again by reopening that dreaded Medicare prescription drug donut hole that we work so hard to close, and that is closed over time in the Affordable Care Act. In 2011 alone, the Affordable Care Act helped nearly 15,000 people in my home state of Rhode Island save an average of $554 by beginning to close the donut hole. Millions of dollars out of the pockets of Rhode Island seniors. That made a big difference for people like Olive, who wrote to me from Woonsocket. Her husband fell into the donut hole last July. Thanks to the new law, Olive and her husband received a discount on their prescription drugs. They saved $2,400. If the Ryan budget passed, they'd be stuck paying that full cost again, $2,400 right out of the pockets of Olive and her husband and into the pockets of the drug companies. Gee, who would be for that around here? In fact, under the Ryan budget, the average senior would be stuck with $4,200 in additional out-of-pocket prescription costs, a huge transfer of wealth from America's seniors to the big drug companies. Repealing the Affordable Care Act wouldn't just harm seniors. It would also mean that insurance plans would no longer have to cover young adults up to age 26 on their parents' plans. This moves over 3 million young Americans just getting out of college, still looking for that first job that has health insurance coverage, back onto the rolls of the uninsured. The radical Ryan budget would also hurt young people by slashing Pell Grants, making college less affordable. Students and graduates are already struggling to pay a record $1 trillion that Americans now owe in outstanding student loans, and the Ryan plan would force students to take on even greater debt burdens. On top of these specific cuts, the Ryan budget takes an additional $1 trillion in unspecified discretionary spending cuts. Now, domestic discretionary funding is the money that's used to keep the government operating each year. FBI agents investigating cases, Border Patrol agents working our borders, doctors and nurses treating veterans at the VA, employees mailing out Social Security checks, and many other important programs and functions. It's already at its lowest level as a share of GDP since the 1950s. It's hard to imagine any federal investment, whether it's education or housing or highways or law enforcement, you name it, not being jeopardized by such draconian cuts. And that is why President Reagan's former economic advisor said about this Ryan budget plan, the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The Reagan economic advisor, Ronald Reagan's economic advisor, said the Ryan plan is a monstrosity. The rich would receive huge tax cuts, while the social safety net would be shredded to pay for them. It is less of a wish list than a fairy tale, utterly disconnected from the real world, backed up by make-believe numbers and unreasonable assumptions. If that's what Ronald Reagan's economic advisor thought about it, think what regular people might think about it. Ryan's plan isn't even an act of courage. It's just pandering to the Tea Party. But that is what's being held hostage on this sequester. Mr. President, I hope when the election season is over, no matter who wins, that Republicans will work with us without insisting on a monstrosity, without insisting on the end of Medicare, on a balanced and reasonable plan to reduce the deficit. With a record national debt, now is no time for more tax giveaways to billionaires, as Mr. Ryan proposes, but rather it is the time to ensure an America where everyone gets a fair shot, everyone pitches in their fair share, and we go forward as a country together as we always have in our best days. I thank the chair and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senior senator from Washington State is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President.